Call a meeting to order. First order of business is roll call.
Representative Andrew? Here. Representative Brown?
Here.
Representative Connolly? Here. Representative Harshman? Here. Representative Nyman?
Here.
Representative Newsom? Here. Representative Obermueller? Here. Representative Summers?
Here.
Chairman Paxton?
Here. Welcome, everyone. I don't know if we have anyone online, but they would be welcome to join in when we go to public comment. We're going to be a little bit out of sync here. We don't have anyone from the Senate that come and present our Senate File 32. So we're going to ask Kari from the State Department if you'll come forward and welcome Superintendent Schrader.
Mr. Chairman, members of the committee, I'm Kari Akins with the Wyoming Department of Education. You will want to make sure you have the engrossed version of the bill in front of you because there were some amendments that were made. This is, of course, not a new bill to this committee, as a lot of work was done over the interim. But we'll go ahead and start looking through page by page. At the bottom of page 1 is the beginning of the section of statute where there are some amendments. Onto page 2, you will see there was an amendment on the Senate side where instead of saying identified by the rules under subsection D of this section, it has identified by the state superintendent on line 3, as there were some amendments later in the bill. Also on line 6, it talks about the number of times that students must be screened for signs of dyslexia and other reading difficulties. That was changed from 4 times a year to 3 times a year. Then also on lines 9 and 10, you'll see the same change that was made earlier on the page about identified by the state superintendent as opposed to identified by the rules under subsection D. So the Senate pretty much made changes to everything on that one. Moving on to page 3, I believe this part remained unchanged as it worked its way through the Senate. This is about adding in language, making sure that school districts are notifying parents as soon as possible once a student is showing signs of dyslexia or other reading difficulties. I believe all of that is unchanged from when it left the interim committee. On to page 4. This is where there were some larger amendments that were made, starting on line 6. As opposed to having the rules specifically identify instruments, instead it says that the rules shall contain criteria to identify instruments. The language later on 9:10 was also added that says, based on the criteria incorporated by rule, the state superintendent shall identify instruments approved for use by school districts. So it still does have the superintendent identifying instruments. It's just not identifying those instruments specifically in rule. Instead, the rules will specify the criteria that those instruments must meet in order to be usable. On to page 5. This is the section, of course, starting on line 7, where it requires the professional development that teachers must receive. There was concern in the Senate Education Committee about having a remaining ongoing annual requirement that just might never go away. And so that requirement for training was instead changed on line 9, on line 18, to be completed not less than once every 3 years as required. So instead of annual training, it would be every 3 years there needs to be training in order to make sure that teachers stay up to date regarding that professional development. I believe the rest of that section, no, were also changes. I'm sorry, Mr. Chairman. If you go to the end of line 20 onto line 21, where it once again does the same change that was made as far as the identification of instruments, the rules that the superintendent promulgates will not specifically identify professional development, but it will identify the criteria to identify appropriate and suitable professional development for those teachers. So the similar change that was made for the instruments was made regarding the professional development. And then, Mr. Chairman, I believe that the rest of the bill remains as it came out of the interim committee, talking about on page 6, section 2, starting on line 4, where there is a required report from the superintendent to the Joint Education Interim Committee, working with various stakeholders that will specify the professional development, also the work on the identifying the criteria, various requirements regarding expenditures in order to calculate if any additional professional development funds would be required. Basically, just the requirements of that group's work are in section 2. And then section 3, starting at the top of page 7, is where there is still appropriated that $300,000 to assist districts with paying for the professional development that is required within this bill. And then, Mr. Chairman, if you go on to page 8, section 4 has the further requirements of this is the stakeholder group that is required specifically to study regarding the identification of those instruments and identifying characteristics of students with dyslexia or other reading difficulties. And then you'll see on page 9 just further requirements to make sure that the work basically continues, requiring updates, requiring identification of the number of students by grade and by district identified as showing signs of dyslexia. This was all information that the interim committee decided they wanted to begin collecting. And then just the required reports and the timeline for submitting those reports, I believe, and for the recommendations regarding the instruments is at the bottom of page 9. And then page 10 has your effective dates, Mr. Chairman.
Okay, thank you for presenting that. Since our Senate comrades are not here, we'll turn the committee loose on you and let them ask any questions that they may have or make any comments.
Well, Mr. Chairman, I was going to say, I believe the superintendent would like to make some comments, and the department has some additional information to
Okay.
provide the committee as well, if you would
All
like.
right. Welcome.
Mr. Chairman, thank you. Members of the committee. I'm Brian Schrader, the Superintendent of Public Instruction, and I'm here to support Senate File 32. Linguistic literacy has to be one of the non-negotiables of education in Wyoming. This is where it all begins. This is the foundation of the entire educational enterprise. Therefore, this must be our highest priority. If we are to lead the nation in education as a state, we must get really good at laying a strong foundation in this area. This bill empowers teachers, administrators, and parents at the local level to set a strong literacy foundation for students in Wyoming. When a student begins showing signs of reading deficiencies or reading disabilities, it must be detected early and remediation must begin immediately. This bill, as amended, supports a common sense, data-driven process for diagnosing reading deficiencies. Specifically, this bill supports improved literacy outcomes by providing professional development to teachers as they identify and implement proven remediation strategies aimed at addressing student needs. Finally, as we all know, literacy intervention is most effective when parents and teachers work together. This bill supports meaningful parent-teacher collaboration. So I support Senate File 32 because it addresses the 3 key players in the entire educational process. Number 1, it addresses the student via approved screeners and assessments. 2, it pulls in the parents by briefing them on the intervention process. And 3, it addresses the teacher component via training and development on how to teach the science of reading. Thank you.
And then, Mr. Chairman, just wanted to note for the committee that in our fiscal note on this bill, there was an administrative impact that was identified for the department. But as noted in that fiscal note, we do have federal funds that can be used for that purpose. The funds would mainly be going towards the stakeholder committee that is required to be assembled and making sure that a national expert can participate in that process.
Okay.
And then if there are any questions that the committee has, we do have our Chief Academic Officer, Shelley Hamill, here
All
to
right.
address those.
Questions from the committee? Yes, go ahead.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And thank you, Kari, for being here and summarizing the bill. I really appreciate it. And I'm just going to assume that you were at the Senate hearings. And can you help us understand about some of the changes that the Senate made from the bill that came out of the Joint Education Committee in two areas? The first one is kind of simple, where we had thought that there should be annual training, and it was changed to 3 years. Do you remember the discussion about that change?
Mr. Chairman, Representative Connolly, I believe it was just the fear that it was adding an annual requirement. And while there was funding at the beginning of this, that funding is set to expire to support in the ability of the districts to be able to provide that professional development. And so they felt that just in case this bill passes and then adjustments are not made in the future, that it would be much more manageable for the school districts in implementation to be ensuring that teachers were receiving this within every 3 years on an ongoing basis, because that training requirement does not go away, but the funding does.
Go ahead.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chairman. And I guess both of my questions go to the desire of this body that we get it done and we get it done right. I mean, that really was the emphasis during the joint interim committee. And this kind of waters it down some by having it every 3 years. So I am a little concerned about that. My next question is about the kind of change which puts the superintendent, rather than rules, in the position of getting assessment instruments. And again, but then later on, we see that there's going to be some rules to inform the superintendent. Okay, so I'm a little confused about slowing down the process. I want to make sure that that's not going on with these changes. So I'm curious about that discussion. Or were those changes merely to reflect your best practices and how you operate within the WDE?
Go ahead.
Mr. Chairman, Representative Connolly, they were 100% requested by the department, that change. That was requested by the Senate, or to the Senate Education Committee. We do have some apprehension about identifying proprietary products in rule. And then also, we just anticipate that because new instruments become available regularly, that we would probably be having to change and adjust that list on a fairly regular basis, which means that we would just always be promulgating those rules in order to keep that list updated. So we wanted to make sure that there was still a process that had stakeholders involved in making sure that there was some accountability on the department's identification of those things and having them involved in that process. So we made sure that there still were rules that were required to provide a good framework that works for everybody. But then it will be the department just making those lists of identified instruments available, and that can be updated as appropriate so long as it still fits within the criteria of the rules.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And I'd like to make a motion to have Ms. Akins, a member of the Senate Education Committee.
All right, anyone else on the committee have questions for State Department folks?
Quick question, Mr. Chairman.
Okay, go ahead.
Back on page 2, the top of page 2, on the identification of the assessment. I know we spent some time, on the interim committee last summer and fall on this, but what do you kind of see as this? I mean, I remember that, I don't have it in front of me, but the report, there was several that are being used around the state, kind of come down to 2 or 3 that are being used the most. I guess are we going to pick one, or are we going to pick 2 or 3 and let districts to choose between a menu of 2 or 3? That's how I understood it when that bill left our joint committee, but when I read this, it doesn't quite say that.
Mr. Chairman, Representative Harshman. So that's exactly the challenge with identifying 2 or 3, as Ms. Akins pointed out, the proprietary naming. The ability to have the criteria established in rule allows for districts that are currently using a valid and reliable screening instrument that might not make the top 3 still be able to continue to use that. So that list would be matched against the criteria on a very regular basis, just like she said, but that provides the flexibility at the district level.
So my question, Mr. Chairman.
Follow up, go ahead.
So my question is, this language in this bill, you think still accomplishes that?
Mr. Chairman, Representative Harshman, I do.
Okay, thank you.
Mr. Chairman.
Yes, Representative Summers.
Mr. Chairman, thank you. And my recollection from the interim was we started with like 3, and then we changed it to this language, recognizing there may be more than that or less than that or whatever, but it was the idea to give the department more flexibility in choosing those.
Okay, any other questions or comments from the committee? All right, thank you. With that, we'll open up public comment. Yes, Mr. Winnie, come forward, please. Identify yourself, tell us who you represent.
Mr. Chairman, Bill Winnie, Sublette County. I support the bill, and I support it for some very personal experiences. You probably have picked up some little pieces of it along the way. It's about our students not falling through the cracks. Because of the vagaries of the military life and the number of times I moved, one of my sons ended up in a school system, not in this state, where in first and second grade, they just really kind of didn't teach him very well about reading. And it took my wife and I, mostly my wife, into third and then the beginning of fourth grade to figure that out. My wife has a master's degree in reading education. Did something I never did. She got a 4.0, graduated with distinction. At any rate, the school system that we were in, or my son was in at that time, was a very well-known, very well-respected school system, and they had a procedure by which a student that had a problem, they would get together a group of 5 teachers and evaluate the student to see what they might do. And they just kind of came to the conclusion he was perhaps a bit slow, but that he was probably going to be okay. My wife went and looked at the testing, went and sat down with the principal of the school and demonstrated it was more than that, quite a bit more. And so at the end of the day, we ended up in the beginning of fourth grade pulling a special program. As I recall, it was in Florida. It had to do with phonics. My wife could explain it better than I. And that pretty much fixed it. I'd say to this day he still has a little bit of a reading problem, but he's probably 90-95% graduate of UW and doing well. You also asked a question, I believe it was Representative Connolly asked the question about a couple of things that came from the other end of the hall. And I would offer you a slightly different perspective on how those things kind of became woven into the amendments woven into the bill. There was a continual series of questions from a couple or 3 members of that body about, well, what if my district is doing okay by all the testing, and why do I need to do this, and along that theme. And that's why I loop back to the concept of it's about kids not falling through the cracks, because my son, as I described to you, would have fallen through the cracks if my wife didn't have that reading education master's and we had the ability to take him down to that school. And so that's, in my opinion, sitting in the galleries, that's why they went from the every year to every 3 years, as they were kind of wending their way around that thought. Just my opinion from the galleries, but subject to your questions. Thank you very much.
Okay, questions from the committee? Thank you, Mr. Winnie. Anyone else like to testify? Please identify yourself, tell us who you represent.
Thank you, Chairman Paxton, and members of the Education Committee. My name is Justin Hesser. I'm a parent of a 3rd grader here in Cheyenne, attending Laramie County School District Number 1. I support SF 32, and I want to briefly explain why. I think some history and perspective are important. Wyoming Statute 21-3-401, as it exists now, and has existed that way since, I think, 2019, sets forth a framework of how schools screen for reading difficulties and identifying struggling readers. It also sets forth a framework for helping those kids through individual reading plans. My wife and I became involved at the legislative level in early 2020 because we discovered that our school district at that time was not properly implementing 21-3-401. For example, we asked for reports for prior years, reports that were required to be done under this statute, and they couldn't provide them. It just wasn't happening in those early years. I believe I provided this committee a lot of that documentation, both my wife and I, through letters. If any of you need that again, just let me know. I'm happy to get it to you. Not only have there been implementation issues, but there was and continues to be misunderstanding of why early screening and identification is important. In first grade, our son struggled to read. We asked his teacher if she could help identify and understand what was going on. Rather than work to identify problems, we were told, he'll catch up. He'll catch up. Don't worry about it. Thankfully, my wife refused to listen, and we pushed, and we got him the help he needed, eventually through an IEP. That came at a great cost, both financially and emotionally. So I want to get to the points of the bill, and the two main points that I think will fix the situation my wife and I had. I think there are two key parts to this. On page 2 of the engrossed copy, the requirement that schools notify parents about the results of screening and provide individualized reading plans. I think that's key, one of the keys to this bill. The second one, on page 5 of the engrossed copy, where it requires schools to provide K-3 teachers, and I think there's an amendment that I would certainly support that part of the amendment about broadening that from teachers to anybody that's involved with reading, interventionists and whatnot. But it requires that they get professional development regarding evidence-based literacy instruction and intervention. If more teachers have this background, then they will be able to identify more kids and get them the help they need. And hopefully the situation my wife and I had can be avoided. And hopefully, the idea of this is not to have a bunch of kids identified and end up on an IEP. It's the exact opposite. It's to identify, get them help early so that they don't end up on an IEP for many years. So with that, I think the only other thing I'll say is, I know the third part of this bill is, I'm gonna call it kind of inside baseball regarding how the districts and the WD work together and all that. From a parent perspective, I understand there are issues about that. There's been some concerns raised. I guess my only ask is, if you got issues with that, either fix it or, vote the bill up, vote the bill down. In the other body, there was an effort to essentially change the statute as it exists now and take a step back. And I would be strongly opposed to any step back in the statute. Certainly support the Senate File 32, but strongly against any step back. With that, I'm happy to answer any questions.
Okay, thank you for your testimony. Anyone from the committee? All right, thank you. Anyone else like to testify? Good afternoon, welcome.
Chairman Paxton, members of the committee, my name is Kevin Mitchell. I'm the Executive Director of the Wyoming Association of School Administrators. And we support all the changes, the amendments that have been added to this bill, and I've been following it since its inception. And my least favorite topic in education is funding. But I am concerned that the amount of money, the original part of this was it was going to be reimbursed. So since this interim work has been going on, I've listened to some of the educators in the state that have testified about some very specific reading intervention programs. They are quite costly and very intensive. One that was mentioned is $75,000 per teacher to get them fully trained. And it takes a period of 1 to 3 years to become fully trained. The other one, I wasn't familiar with that program, so I've done some research. And it kind of runs a gamut, but it's about $15,000 per teacher or employee, as we're saying. It might not be specifically a grade level teacher. So I'm concerned about the limited amount of professional development money with the expectation that every employee that teaches reading in K-3 in districts are going to be required to do professional development. Now, I'm not saying that it has to be in one of these intensive programs, but if they are identified with a very specific reading difficulty, they might require that very intense training. So I've done a little bit of research, talked to who I think is one of the best reading specialists in the state of Wyoming. And he told me, he says, you know, every school ought to have 3 or 4 of these teachers trained in every one of these interventions so that we can use all of those resources to meet the needs of every child that comes through, not just a very specific group or a very specific reading difficulty. So, not to belabor costs, but I'm concerned about the amount of money that's lacking in the professional development that you're want and you're going to continue to ask. And I think in response to Representative Collins, I think 3 years is okay because some of these programs are very intensive for training. It's not like CPR every year that you can just come in and get it. This is a lot different professional development. So Chairman Paxton, I stand for any questions.
Hey, thank you. Representative Somers.
Mr. Chairman, thank you. And so kind of give me these are kind of explain the programs or what, because you have the assessment, right? And then you have the professional development and they're tied, the teacher training's tied into it. It's something you buy from a company, right? Is that correct?
Yes, or possibly outside consultant will come in, but it's their company, yes. And so the assessment might not necessarily be tied to the intervention, though.
Okay. So, Mr.
It
Chair,
might be.
Mr. Chairman, so one thing that we did a while back was take away the assessment money. You know, at one time in the model, there was a little assessment change and it wasn't a big chunk of money. I can't remember, a few million. And then we took that away because we were going to just go with our state assessment. But we ended up not paying for some of the other things, which may very well may be these assessments that we're talking about here. So that's my question is and maybe it's to the department or to you or to both, is the state assessment, does it get down to the detail or the level or of this assessment that we're talking about for reading?
Chairman Paxton, Representative Summers, I would say definitely no. Specifically a screener tool. So we're talking about the benchmark level assessments in the YTOP offered 3 times a year. I'm not an expert. I was on that task force that developed those criteria, but I don't think we ever intended that to replace the screening assessments that are required in this particular state law.
Mr. Chairman?
Go ahead.
Mr. Chairman, thank you. And I would be interested in, you know, I can work with our LSO, but I look out there at WDE, so, and to you. So if we were to consider, or maybe I would consider running an amendment, it probably dies, but maybe I run an amendment that brings back in some of those assessment dollars. My question is, how much, right? That's where I need the expertise of you all, because it's not the full Monty we had before. It's probably something less than. And so I would just ask you to consider that and maybe get me some information.
Chairman Paxton, Representative Summers, if I remember right, it was $20 per student. I can't remember. That's been a few years ago. And I do believe it was a mistake when we zeroed it out because there are all kinds of assessments that school districts do in all different kinds of curricular areas. And they're not all of them tied to YTOP because it's only reading and language arts, mathematics and language arts, so and science. So anyway, I think that was a mistake that we zeroed that out, thinking that those benchmark assessments would be sufficient, and they're not, and especially in relationship to this particular legislation.
And then, Mr. Chairman.
Go ahead.
Mr. Chairman, thank you. And then in the study piece, it's always been my intent anyway, and you know, I'm only one person, but it's always been my intent that if we can identify the same children in each district that are having struggles, then how do we find a way to provide resources, extra resources to those children to get them up to speed? And so that's part of what's in this study, is to understand what the cost of that may be. But if we don't go down the path of recognizing that we may need more resources to get these kids up to speed, and we're just going to bring a club down on people, in the end, that doesn't work. You don't get the desired outcome, particularly in smaller districts, right? Maybe the larger districts can, but the smaller districts can't. So any thoughts on that piece? I mean, how do we get these? Ultimately, how do we help you all get these struggling readers to the point we want them to be successful people in life?
Go ahead.
Chairman Paxton, Representative Summers, I appreciate you bringing those questions, because when we talk about doing interventions, these are sometimes one-on-one interventions where a faculty member can work with no more than 8 students, usually 6, because we don't have school all through the 8 hours, but they're only working with 4 to 6 students per day. And when we were here in Cheyenne earlier in the interim, we had a expert from one of the universities back east talk about that. And it kind of seems like, well, we can just do interventions. You can't just do interventions. They're time consuming and they're personnel consuming. The students that are needing tier 2, tier 3 interventions takes a lot of time. And so we do have some, certainly some categories in our block grant for tutors, at-risk students. But if we're gonna up the game to where we're gonna work on this particular legislation, and I think we should, I'm not disputing that, it's gonna cost more money and more people just to do that, because it's time consuming and it's really intensive.
Okay, anyone else? Okay, thank you, Mr. Mitchell.
Yep, Mr. Chairman.
Oh, go
Kevin,
ahead. Go ahead.
Just a quick question for you. Kevin, I'm perplexed slightly because this is already the law. So I'm curious, if this is already the law and you're already supposed to be doing this, why us sending out a study to determine what 3 screeners or what 5 screeners or whatever we're talking about, why that's ultimately going to cost more money if it's already the law and you guys are already supposed to be doing it? Can you help me wrap my brain around that?
Chairman Paxton, Representative Brown. Yeah, I would say that for me, it's because of the research that I've done, because of the work that you're doing. And so I've become more knowledgeable about some of the different interventions and the cost of training to provide those interventions. So I don't know that it was new. I've done quite a bit of work on my own because of the work that you're doing. That's why it's the first time I've said anything about funding, which I don't like to talk about. But I think in this situation that you should be aware that some of the things that are being asked of districts through this work that you're doing is very costly. Is that?
That works.
Okay, anyone else? Welcome. Good afternoon.
Good afternoon, Mr. Chairman. Boyd Brown, I'm the superintendent in Sheridan County School District Number 3. Been too many places recently, so sorry about that. I want to thank you for your work on this. I think we're headed in the right direction as a state. I think that the Senate did a good job in a couple of their amendments. I think doing the assessments 3 times a year instead of quarterly matches with what we're doing on some of the other assessments. Wanted to talk a little bit about possible help in some of the funding mechanisms. We have an at-risk count in the funding model currently. that at-risk count does not include our K through 3 students who are at jeopardy of not being at reading level. I think that's something that you could add in there to help with some of the funding. The at-risk number of students drives some of the other numbers for tutors and different things like that. So I think there's some ways to do that. Back to Representative Summers' question about the assessment money, I do believe that we need a little help with some of that assessment money to help offset where we're at with trying to make sure that we have all of the screeners that we need and all the benchmark assessments that we need for all of that. But I support the bill and hope that it moves forward. I'd answer questions.
Okay, questions from the committee? All right, thank you. Anyone else? Welcome, Janine.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Mr. Chair, members of the committee, Janine Bayteski from Teton County. I'm a school board trustee. I just want to remind folks that as we're moving forward with these screeners, everything we do in our district has to be ×2. We need to make sure that every assessment that we bring forward has the ability to address our Anglo students as well as our Hispanic students. One of the interesting things that we've done is 13 years ago, we started a dual immersion program, which has been very, very instrumental, I think, in helping. Even though we're sitting at 57% of our third graders as being proficient, I think the number would be much lower had we not started that program and really provided those students with the extra help and exposure that they get. So when we built our new elementary school, and I thank you all for helping to support the funding of that, one of the things that we did was we have a room that has a one-way glass in it. We sent 2 teachers down to Texas every month for a year to be trained as reading interventionists. And what happens is that they take on, as Kevin had mentioned, there's a small group of students that they take on as often as they can. It generally takes somewhere in the neighborhood of 20 to 22 weeks to get the students back on track and up to level. And in order to, I would say, get the most bang for our buck out of the professional development money that we've spent, is other reading teachers sit on the other side of the one-way glass and observe the techniques that are being utilized by the trained experts. So that has certainly helped us to, I would say, stretch the money a little bit. But like I said, I just encourage that as we think about this, every assessment that we have, we need 2 of them. And I have been apprised from our superintendent that be careful how you're looking at what an assessment is, because in her view, some of these assessments are 2-minute assessments. They're just a snapshot to see what's going on with the student and try and pull them back in. So assessment really has a broad definition, and the last thing we want to do is spend all of our time testing kids, right? We just want to make sure that we have the right indications as we're moving forward to be able to course correct as they're learning. Thank you.
Okay, thank you for your testimony. Committee? All right. Anyone else? Welcome.
Mr. Chairman, members of the committee, I'm Grady Hutcherson. I currently serve as the president of the Wyoming Education Association, and I have spent the past 24 years teaching at the 2nd grade level in Goshen County. So I don't even consider myself to be a literacy expert. The science keeps changing. I applaud the effort and dedication you all have taken on this important topic during the interim, as well as now this session. I wanted to share a couple of pieces of information with you, and then I'd be happy afterwards to stand for any questions. But in regards to the professional development piece, I just wanted to share with you, I always worry about potential unintended consequences, and so it's amended to at least or not less than once every 3 years. But I don't think there's been any discussion about the turnover of employees within a district, and that creates a unique challenge, because if you have new K-3 teachers coming in on any given year, they might not then be given access to that professional development. So that's something to take into consideration. Also, I think you've heard some very powerful and important testimony in regards of the costs associated with all of this, including the professional development. I will share with all of you my last full year prior to the pandemic in my district. I spent over 10 days of professional development with one specific reading program that our district had adopted for intervention. I know you all heard a lot of information this summer from various experts in reading. I also want to tell you, I start getting nervous on the floor if it ends up having a lot of amendments from people who aren't experts in the classroom or in reading instruction. Also, just for clarification, you know, in the bill, the screenings with 3 times a year, my experience was that those potentially could be 15 minutes or less per child. But then in addition to that, any student who is an at-risk reader then has ongoing monthly progress monitoring where it is that much shorter, 2 to 3 minutes a day. So I just wanted to share a couple of those points with you. I also really guess I think about this whole issue as an investment, right? We often talk about the cost, but because of the importance and because we know what the research shows for students who struggle with reading as they progress down their educational path, this is really an investment if we can help those at-risk students early on with the reading interventions they need. But keep in mind, you also have classroom teachers, K-3, but then you also have potentially, depending on the district or the school, reading interventionists. And then you also potentially have paraeducators who are working with students. So it becomes very complex, as you all know. I appreciate and thank all of the work that you continue to do for education. I'd stand for any questions.
Okay, questions from the committee? Yes, go ahead.
Chairman, thank you. Thank you. Just to be clear, and you know, I think your point about once a child has been identified, maybe is struggling a little bit on a screener, that, you know, these monthly check-ins, these real quick 2-minute check-ins, and it's ongoing, really part of the instruction. That doesn't really say that anywhere in the bill, does it? I mean, I don't think it. Is that your point on that, or were you just trying to educate us a little bit about the real world, how that's working?
Mr. Chairman, Representative Harshman, I was just trying to share that additional information. I don't think it needs to be in the legislation, but I wanted to make sure that you all understood for at-risk readers, they're not only being screened 3 times a year, they're also, you know, being progress monitored regularly throughout the year. So I just wanted you to be aware.
Yeah, very good. Thank you.
Okay, other comments, questions from the committee? All right, thank you for your testimony. Anyone else like to testify? Welcome.
Thank you, Chairman Paxton and members of the committee. I apologize for reading from a script, but I still get a little nervous when I'm speaking up here. My name is Gay Wilson, and I am here today to testify as the former Laramie County School District #1 teacher of 21 years. Over those 21 years, I taught 2nd grade for 6 years, 6th grade for 5 years, and I worked for 10 years as a reading specialist working with at-risk readers from kindergarten through grade 6. One of the reasons I'm here today is to thank you all for working so hard on this extremely important piece of legislation over the past year. I have to admit I've been a little bit of a groupie this year, and I've been following you to the Joint Education Interim Committee meetings at Saratoga, Casper, and back to Cheyenne. And why was I doing that? Because this piece of legislation is so near and dear to my heart. So the main reason I'm here today is to encourage you to pass Senate File 32. Please believe me when I tell you that the passage of this bill could not be more important for our Wyoming children, and that time is absolutely of the essence. Although I know good legislation takes time to get right, There needs to be a sense of urgency with this bill for our children in Wyoming in order for them to get the appropriate reading instruction and interventions they need, and that they should have the right to in order for them to be successful students in school and later as adults. I would first like to address the section of the bill regarding reading assessments. I would like to share my experiences with you as I've used both type of assessments that we have heard talked about over the last year at the hearings. With universal screeners, I've used this type of assessment for 10 years. The point of these criterion-referenced assessments is to give us important and informative information quickly, especially at the beginning of the school year, so we know right away which students are most at risk for reading difficulties. These screeners only take 5 to 7 minutes per student. In the Title I school where I worked for 12 years, we could assess 500 students with 5 people in 3 days. By the end of the 3rd day, we knew where every student was with their foundational reading skills and which students we needed to conduct further diagnostic testing with. Please keep in mind that these type of screeners have over 30 years of research on validity and reliability, and the benefits of using them are enormous. Screeners have both predictive and instructional value. The other assessment instrument that I've heard a lot about is the Fontesom benchmark assessments. I used this type of formative assessment for 6 years when I taught 2nd grade. This type of assessment will give you information on what level a student is reading, a level A, a level B, but not which foundational skills a child is missing. It has little if any research to support it. Also, this type of assessment is not quick. It takes anywhere from 20 to 40 minutes, depending on the grade level, to give, and is usually given by the classroom teacher. So testing my 23 2nd graders would take me 2 to 3 weeks to find out which students were at risk. This was very frustrating, knowing I could have screened my students in 5 minutes apiece, so I could move quickly to determine who needed further testing. To give these assessments, I usually had to give my precious little planning time up and go grab kids out of PE, music, or art. Or I had to do it while kids were in the classroom. And because I would need to work one-on-one with the student, the other students couldn't bother me, so these poor kiddos spent 12 hours of instructional learning time working on their own. Did I provide quality independent activities? Of course I did. But it's still 12 hours of instructional learning time that has now been lost. Now imagine having to do this each quarter. The question you need to ask yourself, though, is this. Is this type of assessment at the beginning of the year a quick and efficient way to screen students to see if they're at risk? Absolutely not. Imagine if I had been a novice teacher who didn't understand the what and the whys behind the mistakes children were making and wouldn't have the information or knowledge to make good instructional decisions when I did the Fontesom assessment. Obviously, this type of assessment is not a screener, nor can it be used as a progress monitor to do students every week. Does it serve the triangulation of data? Of course it does. Does it give teachers some good information? Yes, it does. But it does not serve the purpose that we need as a screener at the beginning of the school year. With regard to the foundational reading skills, we learned from Dr. Pugh how we need to identify the gaps in reading skills early. An analogy one of my friends uses is to think of it like a cavity. The sooner you get to it and get it filled, you can save the tooth. So I like to think that these foundational skills must be taught first. The instruction should not include teaching students to guess at words, use picture clues, reading around the word, or using words in sentences to try to make sense. I kindly ask you, would you build a house from the top down, or would you build a house with a strong and sturdy foundation to support the rest of the house on top of it? One of the criticisms of foundational skills being taught first is that people have the misconception that this is all they do. Kids are just word callers. I've heard them refer to that. But make no mistake, students who are gaining these beginning reading skills are still hearing connected text through read-alouds, then with decodable books, and then finally with what some would call leveled readers when they're capable of doing so. But that's only once they know how to connect those letters and sounds together. No guess and checks involved. I've taught whole language approaches, including Reader's Workshop and phonics-based approaches, and the differences are tremendous with our at-risk readers. If you want to see change in the reading scores of the students in this state and have them increase, structured literacy is a must, along with an effective MTSS system to move students in and out of appropriate interventions. Special ed should not be a life sentence. With effectively trained teachers and staff and appropriate interventions, you can keep children from going there in the first place. Therefore, I would highly recommend that the rules contain criteria to help identify appropriate and suitable professional development materials for staff with regard to literacy instruction and intervention materials. Teachers should not just be working with one student at a time. Research does not support this approach. You can have as much success with working with 3 students at a time as 1. With teacher training in the bill, it states that districts would need to have teachers trained in evidence-based literacy instruction and interventions. But I would highly recommend that all district employees, and I was glad to see that, who work with at-risk students be trained. In my world, perfect world, we would have a tiered system of training so that any staff member giving reading instruction understands how children learn to read. In my mind, Tier 1 would support pairs, librarians, or tutors who work with at-risk readers and give them the knowledge and understanding of how children learn to read. It would be a quick one-day training. They do not need the full training that teachers would get or interventionists. At Tier 2, you would support classroom teachers with even more in-depth training, so they are aware of the signs of reading difficulties or dyslexia and know what to do with these students to grow them forward, and what materials to use in the classroom or an intervention group that they might be teaching. At a Tier 3 level, we would support reading interventionists, Title I, and special education teachers who teach our most at-risk readers. They should have the most in-depth training on specific evidence-based interventions, not just the knowledge base of how children learn to read. One of the things that makes my heart heavy, and the last point I will make, is watching districts hire Title I or special ed teachers with no or little training and experience in working with our at-most readers, which is an injustice to them all. If you want to see growth in our students' reading scores, it is paramount to get all of the district staff who work with our at-risk readers trained as quickly as possible. In closing, again, I want to sincerely thank all of you for your time and hard work that you have put into this bill. It's a major step forward for our students and their families. As a building intervention team chair and reading intervention liaison at BIT meetings, I have sat in over 650 building intervention meetings, and I've seen the pain on parents' faces and heard in the anguish in their voices because they are at a loss for how to help their child learn how to read. Parents need to be better informed and provided with more support on how they can help their child. Principals need to be more proactive in getting the services that our most at-risk students need quickly and not languish in the system. No longer can we continue to pass these children on without getting the appropriate instruction and interventions they need to be successful in life. I'm here today because of all the children over the years that I've had sitting in my reading intervention groups with tears streaming down their face and telling me how stupid they feel because they don't know how to read and blaming themselves for their lack of reading. I'm tired of them beating themselves up because they can't read as good as their classmates and wondering, what's wrong with me? This needs to end. I hope and pray with all my might that it starts happening today and during this legislative session. You have the power to help these children never feel stupid again. As Chairman Scott stated in the Senate committee meeting last week, this is just a beginning, that there is a lot more work to be done with reading in our state. This can be an exciting and very much needed place to start that work. I would be happy to take any questions if there are none. I would like to sincerely thank you for letting me express my concerns.
Questions from the committee? You know, I really appreciate your testimony today. You know, someone who's actually had a lot of practical experience working in the classroom with those folks and seen the whole emotional things that go along with it. And as a former K-12 principal, I share some of your experiences for certain with the kids and with the parents. And there is a lot of emotion involved with that. And especially when you have to retain a child for reasons and those kind of things, it really does cause some real problems. So I really appreciate all your great testimony and thank you for being a groupie and following us.
Thank you, Chairman Paxton. I appreciate that, and I appreciate everything you're doing. Thank you.
Okay, anyone else like to testify? Anyone else? Do we have anyone online? Anyone else? You know, this bill is probably one of the most important pieces of legislation that we're going to pass. And we've got to get it right. And I know that when we finish with this, it won't be perfect and we may have to have some follow-up things next year. But I think some things have surfaced today that indicates that maybe we're not quite ready to move this thing forward yet. I don't know what the rest of the committee feels like this. We've had a little dialogue up front. You've probably seen us talking back and forth a bit here. But it seems to me that especially on the money side of things, you know, we want to make sure that we have put enough dollars in this thing to make it successful when we do pass it. There may be some other things that to go along with that, but just like to hear from the other members of the committee. I know we've talked to a couple of you, but how do you feel about that?
Mr. Chairman, thank you. You know, we have a pretty large amendment, and I don't think the committee's probably had time to digest it. And I think there are some other issues, and I'd like to see the committee be able to digest the amendment, us a chance to work it better and do it better maybe on Wednesday or something. But that's my 10 cents.
Mr. Chairman.
Go ahead.
Mr. Chairman, I agree with the sentiment that maybe giving it another day to digest this. With that being said, you know, I've provided everybody on the dais with a copy of the amendment, and I believe actually in the gallery there was copies being made, so more people were able to get their hands on it. But that being said, I'd be more than happy to go through the amendment to show everybody what we're looking at doing. That way they can digest exactly what we're talking about. I have an enrolled version of the bill, so everybody can actually read through that. I'll be more than happy to send that out as well if needed. But I do think that you're absolutely right. I think this was my baby, right? This is what I wanted to see happen this year, and I'm happy to see it getting through to where we are right now, but we need to make sure it's done correctly. So, you know, at the call for it, I'll be more than happy to go through the amendment. If anybody else has any other discussion, I'm happy to entertain that as well.
I think that would be appropriate this time, if you'd like to go through that. It seems like we have time, so go ahead.
Okay, Mr. Chairman. Ladies and gentlemen, what you've got before you is a long amendment. It looks very technical in nature, but truthfully what we're doing here is doing a lot of cleanup and trying to make this a little more simplistic to read. And so what I'll do is I'll try to walk you through each one of these steps of the amendment, trying to make this as clean and easy as possible. So if there's any questions, please hop in at the time frame that you have the question, so that way I can keep my frame of mind moving there with that. Starting with the amendment, I'll try to go back and forth with the amendment and the bill, but starting with the amendment, the biggest portion that you're going to find is on line 6. And what we do here is on page 2 of the bill, line 2, we are inserting reading assessment and reading intervention. We want to make sure that we're talking specifically on the reading assessment and reading intervention. And then we continue on and we clarify that this is going to be part of the grade level reading skills pursuant to, as part of the district multi-tier system of support. So one of the things that I've heard multiple times through different teachers and people who are in the realm of K through 3 reading is that they need this to be part of the MTSS, and that this really does need to be a major portion of it. And if we're not mentioning that, we're not really incorporating that. So that's exactly what this is. And you may have heard MTSS. Most of us heard that through the interim. That's what we're doing here. Moving on down on the rest of the bill, you'll see that we continue with the current language, but then on line 4, we insert that identified by the state superintendent under subsection D of this section that screens for grade level reading skills pursuant to subsection D of this section. Really what we're trying to do here is just again clarify that we're staying within the grade level. We want to make sure that we're not testing every single kid in K through 3 on all the exact same things. There are things that you will screen for in kindergarten that you won't screen for in first grade, and things in first grade that you won't screen for in second grade, and vice versa. So that's what we're doing with that. And that's going to be all on page 2 that we have. If we flip over to page 3, on page 3 of the bill, we start going into a little bit more of just some cleaning up language. So as soon as practical after the assessment or screening is conducted as established in subsection A of this section, each school district shall provide a copy of the screening results, including an explanation of the screening results to the parent, guardian, or other person having control of each student. Really what we did with this, and I'll just finish that off because it does continue, of each student not showing grade level benchmark reading competence on reading skills under this section. Really what we're doing is just, again, clarifying that we're talking about grade level reading, number one, and that we're also talking about getting a plain language report back to the parents, something that parents can understand. When you get this information back as a teacher, you'll probably be able to dissect it as a teacher, but as a parent looking at this, they may not be able to understand it. So that's what we're doing on lines 1 through 7. And then it goes on to page 4 is the next section of the amendment. There is going to be, and I will clean this up since we're going to lay this back a day, I will actually have this cleaned up. I have reading and intervention program. I have program struck. That is not supposed to be struck. But then we come back in as part of the district multi-tiered system of support again. And then we continue on down with adding in grade level reading skills. Again, just verifying that we have the grade level reading skills. We're not trying to do again, third grade to kindergarten comparisons. We just want what the grade level is. Flipping over to page 5 of the bill, page 2 of the amendment. We are going to go back. The language that is on here, it says shall collect kindergarten through grade 2. We're going to strike 2 and insert grade level 3. The name of the bill is K through 3 reading assessment, so we definitely need to make sure that we're collecting the K through 3. This is probably the biggest portion, is on page 5, the new language here. We did, as was mentioned by a few people in testimony today, we strike the word teacher and insert district employee. The main purpose for this is we have a lot of personnel that are outside the scope of being a teacher that are working with our students learning how to read. We want to make sure that any personnel that is involved with the teaching is also involved in this professional development. So including that district employees, I heard the testimony from Ms. Wilson that if we have librarians, if they're paras, if they're down to reading interventionists, whatever the case may be, those are what we're talking about. So that's the biggest, what I would say is maybe considered the largest and most impactful change in this entire amendment. Flipping over to page 6. If you go to page 6, we end up coming down to section 2. And what we change here is a few small words. We insert on line 6 on the minimum professional development required. Reason we want the minimum is we want to know what that base level is. We want to know what the minimum level that everybody is understanding and what that's going to be required, so we as a committee understand exactly what we're going to be looking for as we move forward. Again, we add reading intervention program on line 11. That really doesn't do a whole bunch. And then I have district employees again on line 19 as opposed to just school teachers. Page 7, lucky enough we don't have anything in there, but my guess is after today's discussion we will likely have some changes to page 7, so no page will be left untouched on this bill. Going on to page 8 is a little bit more new language, and I will read this, how it will read, and then I'll explain it. So the state superintendent, in consultation with the experts credentialed in dyslexia and other reading difficulties, school district personnel involved with reading instruction, and other appropriate stakeholders, including parent literacy advocates, shall conduct a study to identify characteristics of students with dyslexia or other reading difficulties that place the student at risk of not meeting the educational outcomes necessary to graduate from high school, and the best assessments to measure those characteristics. This is honestly almost identical to the language that we actually already have in law right now underneath 21.3.401. The only thing that we have that's different in this is in bringing in including parental literacy advocates. And this is ultimately just trying to line up the language that we currently have, and it broadens the scope that the superintendent has the authority to bring in in consultation with whom he sees, whom she sees, the correct people to bring to the table for this discussion. And then, Mr. Chairman, finally, moving over to page 9. On page 9, I'll read this one as well. Based on the longitudinal data collection required underneath Wyoming Statute 21.3.401D, the study required under subsection A of this section shall include the aggregate number of students by grade and by district identified as not demonstrating benchmark proficiency on grade level reading material or reading skills as measured by the district's screening assessment. The study shall also identify the aggregate number of students by grade and by district identified as below benchmarks of grade level reading skills pursuant to Wyoming Statute 213401D that are also identified as at-risk students underneath 2113-309. So what we're really trying to do there is what the majority floor leader brought up a little bit earlier, trying to make sure that we identify not only those that are not demonstrating their benchmark, but also that are identified as at risk. And we want to make sure that we have all of that information put there. Again, it's a little wonky. That's why I had this enrolled copy created to try to make this read a little bit better. And then, Mr. Chairman, that is the entirety of the amendment. I did not read through the language that we were struck. I feel it reads a little easier when I don't go through that. So with that, Mr. Chairman, I'll stand for any questions on the amendment.
Okay, questions from the committee? All right, do we require a motion to lay this back until Wednesday, or is that the prerogative of the chair?
Prerogative of the chair.
All right. Anything further on this particular issue before I make the statement to lay it back until Wednesday? Yeah, we really appreciate all the input from all you folks out there that have helped us, and I'm sure that in order to get this right, we'll be calling on you in the next day or two to see if we can't get a better product in the end. So thank you for doing that, and we hope you'll show up again on Wednesday and provide us with the guidance we need to make this the best bill we can get. So thank you for that.
Yeah, Mr.
Okay,
Chairman?
yes, go ahead.
Yeah, Mr. Chairman, I am and will be curious about the dollar figure, and I think it's section 7, and information needed in order to have the correct dollar figure there.
I'm sure our friends with the State Department will be very helpful along those lines.
Mr. Chairman?
Yes, go ahead.
Yeah, particularly for me, it's the assessment piece, how much did we put into the model before? What does it really require now? What would it require now for these screeners, which is different than what that was intended for originally? So how much is that a student and what's that dollar figure? And just to get an idea, I mean, we may, one of us may bring that as a committee of the whole if we don't want to muck up the bill, but certainly, and then on the professional development, if the number's not 300,000, what is it? Do we have any idea what this may or may not cost? And if you don't, we just stick with what we got and then we find out.
Mr. Chairman?
Yes, go ahead.
Mr. Chairman, if I could have the Department of Education, they mentioned something in their opening remarks about having federal funds that you guys could supplant this with. Can we maybe get a little bit of discussion on that? Because I think I misunderstood it compared to what a couple other committee members did. And so if maybe we can just get a little bit of discussion on that.
And I think we have to be careful about knowing if these are one-time funds too, because we intend this to be an ongoing program. So we may need some, the federal funds would certainly help in getting the program off the ground, but if we intend this to be an ongoing thing, which we do, then we need to make sure we have the right appropriations in there to going forward. So give us some help on this if you can, please.
Certainly, Mr. Chairman, members of the committee. So as far as the federal funds that we would be using, it would be a combination of funds from the Comprehensive State Literacy Development Grant that we received from the U.S. Department of Education, and then also some of the federal COVID funds that we received directly as an agency. So in fact, both of the funding sources that we are looking at in order both to cover the administrative impact of this bill as far as doing the stakeholder committee, and then also we already have put federal COVID funds towards offering literacy, professional development, and are planning to continue to do that. But both of those will expire. We will have an opportunity to, the Comprehensive State Literacy Development Grant is a competitive grant, and we would have the opportunity to apply for that again. I believe we have 4 more years left on that grant cycle. As far as the federal COVID relief funds, our agency has through the end of 2024 to expend those funds.
And I would anticipate that we may have a larger number of people just because of the COVID impacts initially, if and when this bill passes. And then it may level off at some point in time, but we need to know what we can do, how much money we need in there to sustain the program over time.
Mr. Chairman.
Go ahead.
Mr. Chairman, thank you. And obviously, at least is my recollection from the interim, is that if you look at the crew report, that not all the professional development dollars are spent on professional development. So, probably 300,000 is, probably okay, because it's just 1 year, right? And we're doing a study to ascertain the level of professional development that's needed, and then I think we can refine this. So I'm not so much concerned about that number as I am understanding the assessment number. Particularly if we being you all, if you all and WD choose certain screeners that are at certain costs and they're not tied to our current YTOP program, then, it would be interesting to see, well, what is that cost and whether we could understand that and decide whether we would want to put it in the model. Does that make sense?
Perfect. Okay. Yes, Representative Harshman.
Mr. Chairman, just a question of the department, really, and really for us, I think kind of got two things going on. I think we've got this talk about, the fourth grade YTOP and 57% or whatever, 55% or whatever that number is. And I think, when we started down this road, I don't know, 15 years ago, the Wyoming Accountability and Education Act, and I remember, that there were states that were doing way worse than us on the NAEP, but had like 90% proficient. And it's all because of where you set that score. And I think, and it says this in here about reports and the number of children that might need interventions and those kind of things, but I think we got to think a little more too in the next 48 hours. Really, how are we going to keep score on this to know that the investment is paying off? And I don't think it's the YTOP. I don't know if any of you took the fourth grade reading test. I sent it to the whole committee to go ahead and try it and take it.
Failed it.
But the problem with that is, it's that old thing we've been talking about. It's hard to measure change when you keep changing the measure. And so I think we got to get this figured out, I think, before we meet Wednesday. And if it's on these number of children who need interventions who are first reported and then where they end up, fair enough, but that creates another system. And unless we're just going to say in statute, hey, we're not changing the fourth grade YTOP reading, it's just not going to change. And because we know, as we get better, we move the bar. And so, because politically, we're going to keep it right around that 55%. It's just, we're not going to have 90% of the kids proficient on the YTOP. We just won't allow it to happen. So we're in this conundrum, and I think we better figure that thing out. Because there's some kids who are struggling reading. 15% of our kids are on IEPs. They're still taking the fourth grade YTOP. That doesn't mean they can't read at all. And I think it's important for people who are watching, we got this kind of narrative out there like half our kids can't read. That's not true. And, but I think we want to make sure we do this the right way, and then we get the right feedback to know that we're going to win on this thing, and that we're going to reduce those numbers down. And so let's all think about that. And if you have any comments on that, I'd sure like to hear them.
Shelley, go ahead.
Yeah, Mr. Chairman and Representative Harshman, if the amendments that you're considering are successful and we're able to identify a potential list of valid and reliable screeners, the information, and as it's written, districts would be reporting on those subsets using those valid and reliable screeners. Those would create a situation where we'd have better comparisons and more consistent numbers than what we're able to get from, like what you say, the YTOP as the target is consistently shifting.
Mr. Chairman.
Go ahead. Just to follow up, I think let's make sure we kind of, dot the I's, cross the T on that in the next 48 hours. And if there's some language we need to really put in here to strengthen that part, because it's not the YTOP. But the YTOP, Well, House Bill 297 and 19 started this, right? And there were some parents that I worked with and, we got that bill passed. But I think the YTOP has started this current conversation. I really believe that. I think that's what's driven a lot of this, and fair enough, but I just want to make sure we got some way to, have a goalpost, and not a moving goalpost.
Representative, oh, sorry, are you
No,
finished?
I'm good, thank you.
Representative Summers.
Mr. Chairman and Shelley, I hope you look at this amendment and see, to me, the studies about finding the means to identify the child and then understanding what those numbers are and whether we can afford to put more resources towards those children. That's what it is for me. And so when it says here, shall conduct a study to identify characteristics of students with dyslexia or other reading difficulties that place the student at risk of not meeting the educational outcomes necessary to graduate. And so I want you to make sure, or at least tell me what you think about the new language and if that gets us to where I want to see us go, which is to be able to identify that child that's struggling at reading and then ultimately to be able to put some resources towards that child.
As early as possible.
And
Okay.
Mr.
Yes, go
Yeah,
ahead.
Mr. Chairman, I'm just going to pile on. Outside of the SPED process, right? That's really the desire, is to identify those kiddos really early on and getting the help they need without them falling 2 standard deviations behind. That's what we really want to get a handle on quickly.
Yes, Janine. A little out of order, but.
First of all, when we switched to YTOP, the teachers were asked. When we switched to YTOP and teachers were asked what they wanted out of YTOP, one of the first things they said was stability. Quit changing the goalposts, quit changing the cut scores, quit changing the test every year. That was number one. Number two, and Representative Summers, I'm sure you remember this with me, is after the accountability system was being put to rest, and to take what Representative Brown said about the multi-tiered system of support, we started that process and we bailed out on it on a statewide basis because it cost money.
Okay, anything else before we adjourn? We appreciate all your input. We do take a little latitude once in a while with our process, but in the end, I think it makes for a better product. So thank you all for coming, and we'll see you hopefully again on Wednesday.